Good morning, children. Once again, revision session for class 11. What is the main message of the story, The Address? The Address by Markham Minko revolves around the theme of crisis that we as an individual encounter in our daily life. War brings destruction, pain and loss of lives which impact humans in various ways. However, this story speaks about the narrator and mother's life, how they are disrupted due to war. Why did the narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, specially make a trip to 46 Marconi Street? Did she achieve her purpose? The narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, specially made a trip to 46 Marconi Street to get back her mother's priceless belongings, which Mrs. Darling had taken from her mother with the understanding that she would return them after the war. No, she did not achieve her purpose as she could not get them back. The narrator met with an extremely cold and unfriendly atmosphere at 46 Marconi Street. Mrs. Darling did not like that she had come back for them. She refused to recognize her first. She did not allow the narrator to enter their house. Then she pretended to be busy and closed the door on her face. How did Mrs. Darling receive Mrs. S.'s daughter when she came back after several years? How do you explain her behavior? So here's the answer. Mrs. Darling was extremely cold and unfriendly to the narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter. When she came back after several years, she understood she had come to claim the beautiful possessions like antiques and silver cutlery which had belonged to her family. Mrs. Darling had no intention of returning them. Therefore, she was cold and rude. She did not want to return those things. Costly things. She did not even let her in. She told her that she could not do anything for her. It was not convenient for her to meet the narrator and that she should come at some other time. Then she closed the door while the narrator was still on the doorstep. Imagine what a rude behavior. Describe the second visit of Mrs. S.'s daughter to the house of Mrs. Darling. Why did she not want to meet Mrs. Darling? Here's the answer. When the narrator went the second time to 46 Marconi Street, it was Mrs. Darling's daughter who opened the door and let the narrator come into the house. Immediately, she recognized her mother's priceless possessions. She noticed the Hanukkah, which belonged to her family. She was immediately able to make out the walls had the antiques. Her familiar woolen tablecloth was on the table, and she recognized a painting, the teapot and the silver cutlery of her family. Seeing these things, however, they did not give her any pleasure because they were arranged in a tasteless way and handled carelessly. She was filled with disgust and suddenly lost the desire to get those beautiful things back. She did not want to meet Mrs. Darling and left the house, decided never to visit 46 Marconi Street again. That means she decided to forget this particular address. Why? Because it was of no use to her. How did Mrs. Darling acquire the possessions of Mrs. S? What extraordinary circumstances made it possible? Do you justify Mrs. Dorling's conduct? No, it can never be justified. Mrs. Dorling was merely an acquaintance of Mrs. S. Mrs. S. belonged to a wealthy Jewish family, and all her possessions were beautiful and of great value. The Second World War broke out, and the Jews were persecuted everywhere. The Germans were in control. The Jews had to leave their homes and possessions behind to save their lives. In this background, Mrs. Dorling revived her acquaintance with Mrs. S. and carried away suitcases and sackfuls of precious things, saying she wanted to save all the nice things. Mrs. Dorling had no intention of returning those fine things. Mrs. Dorling's behavior cannot be justified. She acted out of greed and meanness. She did not even admit Mrs. S.'s daughter into her house and was exceedingly rude to her. Why did the narrator say that forgetting Mrs. Dorling's address would be the easiest of all the things? The narrator said that forgetting 46 Marconi Street, this particular address, would be easy because of the painful experience of the narrator. Besides, Mrs. Dorling did not take good care of her mother's possessions. She was saddened to see the crudeness of Mrs. Dorling's household and the insensitive way the precious antiques of her family were handled. She immediately decided to forget about everything connected with her past. She wanted to continue living her new life. She resolved to forget the address, as she felt that of all the things she had to forget, forgetting the address would be the easiest. Compare the lifestyle of Mrs. S. before her daughters after the war. Before the war, Mrs. S. and her daughter lived a life of comfort and luxury. Their house was full of beautiful things and expensive antiques. Their everyday cutlery was made of silver. After the war, Mrs. S.'s daughter came back to town alone. The family was probably dead. She lived in a small room. The bread that she ate was dark and tasteless. She had seen fear and insecurity. She did not even have place to keep cutlery. Her lifestyle did not at all resemble her earlier luxurious living. Very important, this question. Justify the title of the story, the address. This question is very important. Very often you get it in the examination, especially in the annual examination. The address is a title that indirectly brings out the pain that war inflicted on the narrator. The address was 46 Marconi Street, where a woman named Mrs. Dorling lived with her family. The address was important to the narrator because her mother had given the family valuables to Mrs. Dorling for safekeeping. When after the war the narrator went back to the address, she found her family's precious possessions in an ugly setting. Their value was not appreciated and they were used carelessly. She was so repelled that she decided to leave the things and forget the address. The address becomes too painful to remember. It becomes symbolic of the shabbiness and the pettiness of Mrs. Dorling. She was very keen about getting things back, but ironically resolved to forget what? This particular address. She wanted to leave her past behind. Where had the narrator come? Why was she back? The answer, children, the narrator is a Dutch Jew who had to leave Holland during the Second World War. She had left along with her mother to safety. Now she was back to where the past things lay. But she did not get a good treatment by the lady of this house of 46 Marconi Street. She wanted to see and touch her belongings of her mother, in order to relive those memories. Which memories? The time, the moment which she enjoyed with her mother, the time when her mother was alive. Okay, now question number 2. Whom did the narrator desire to meet in Holland and why? The narrator was told by her mother to remember number 46 Marconi Street, where Mrs. Darling lived. She had insisted on keeping their things safely till the war was over. After the war, the narrator was curious about their possessions that were still at that address, and she went to meet Mrs. Darling, though she did not receive a good treatment there. What kind of a welcome did the narrator get from Mrs. Darling? Mrs. Darling was cold and indifferent and evidently displeased to see the author. She did not want her to come because she would ask her to give her things back. In fact, she tried to prevent her from entering by blocking her entrance. Later, she said it was not convenient for her to talk to the narrator at that point of time and refused to meet her. If you remember, children, initially when the author had come, she even refused to recognize her. When did the narrator first learn about the existence of Mrs. Darling? The narrator recalled the time when she was home during the first half of the war. She had noticed that various things were missing. Her mother then told her about Mrs. Darling, an old acquaintance who renewed their contact and came regularly each time, carrying away some of their things. What was the narrator's mother's opinion about Mrs. Darling? The narrator's mother considered Mrs. Darling a very benevolent lady who strived to save their nice things by carrying some of them away each time she visited. The narrator's mother was unable to see through the lady who wished to cheat her out of her valuables. The mother never thought of such a thing, that her friend would cheat her one day. Instead, she felt grateful to Mrs. Darling. She never expected that such a thing would happen, that one day she would not recognize her daughter. What did the narrator recall about her first meeting with Mrs. Darling? The narrator saw Mrs. Darling for the first time on the morning after the day she came to know about her. Coming downstairs, the narrator saw her mother about to see someone out. It was a woman dressed in a brown coat and a shapeless hat with a broad back. She nodded and picked up the suitcase. Question number 7. Why did the narrator return to Marconi Street after a long time? Here's the answer, children. The narrator returned to Marconi Street after a long time because in the beginning, after the liberation, that is, after the war was over, she was not interested in all that stored stuff. She had lost her mother and was also afraid of being confronted with things that remained as a painful reminder to their past. How did the narrator decide to go back to the things? Gradually, when everything became normal, again the bread was of a lighter color. That means the quality improved, and she had a bed to sleep in securely, that means safely, and the surroundings became familiar again. The narrator was curious about all the possessions that must still be at that address that her mother had talked about and were there to relive her memories. Gradually, when everything became normal, I already said that to you, the quality of bread improved and things improved. She wanted to relive her memories, but unfortunately, she was so saddened by the behavior of Mrs. Tolling. Explain, I stopped, horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. When the narrator went to Mrs. Tolling's house the second time, a girl of about 33. A girl of about 15 let her in. She saw familiar things but arranged differently that lent unfamiliarity to the surroundings. She found herself surrounded by the things that she had wanted to see again, but which really oppressed her in that strange atmosphere. Why did the narrator not want to remember the place? The narrator had primarily returned for the sake of memories that were linked to the things that had once belonged to her mother. However, she realized the objects linked in her memory with the familiar life that she had once lived lost their value as they had been removed and put in strange surroundings. Once again, have a look at these questions and answers. Where had the narrator come? Why was she back? The narrator is a Dutch Jew who had to what? Who had to? Come on, tell me, children. Who had to leave Holland during the Second World War? She had left along with her mother for safety. Now she was back to where her past things lay. She wanted to see and touch her belongings in order to relive those memories. Whom did the narrator desire to meet in Holland? Why? The narrator was told by her mother to remember 46 Marconi Street, where Mrs. Tolling lived. She had insisted on keeping their things safely till the war was over. Yes. After the war, the narrator was curious about their possessions. What kind of a welcome did the narrator get from Mrs. Tolling? Mrs. Tolling was cold and indifferent and evidently unhappy, displeased to see the author. In fact, she tried to prevent her from entering by blocking her entrance. Later, she said it was not convenient for her to talk to the narrator at that point of time and refused to meet her. When did the narrator first learn about the existence of Mrs. Tolling? The narrator recalled the time when she was home during the first half of the war. She had noticed the various things were missing. Her mother then told her about Mrs. Tolling, an old acquaintance who renewed their contact. Yes, and came regularly, each time carrying away some of their things. What was the narrator's mother's opinion about Mrs. Tolling? The narrator's mother considered Mrs. Tolling a benevolent lady. She thought her to be a very nice lady, very cooperative, helpful by nature. She turned out to be what? Very rude, very harsh to the narrator. The narrator's mother was unable to see through the lady who wished to cheat her out of her valuables. She never expected that one day she would be cheated by this lady. Unexpected. When did the narrator recall about her first meeting with Mrs. Tolling? The narrator saw Mrs. Tolling for the first time on the morning after the day she came to know about her. Coming downstairs, the narrator saw her mother about to see someone out. It was a woman dressed in a brown coat and a shapeless hat with a broad bag. She nodded and picked up the suitcase. So children, we have done some very important questions and answers in this session. From which story? From which lesson? Yes, the address. Very important from the point of view of examination. Note down all the questions and answers that I have done in this session. Read again and again. Read and revise. Exams are fast approaching. Go through the lesson, go through the questions and answers. That's all, children. Thank you. Goodbye.